Good turnout. All right. Awesome. Great. Like me, I think we're all very interested. Very timely, isn't it? Yeah, very scary and very timely. I'm Sue Hatch. I'm on the seminar committee, and it is my great privilege today to introduce Fletcher Crowe, who will be our speaker. I just want to, I'm talking to this camera, people on YouTube as well as you, so I'm trying to focus on both. And I want folks on YouTube as well as folks here to know, due to technical difficulties, we will not be seeing Fletcher, but he's there and we will hear him, all right? But we will be able to see his slides, and his slides are great. So just so everybody knows what's going on. And we will be afterwards able to ask questions. And what I'll do is I'll come back up here to answer, and what I'll do is I'll have you ask the question. If Fletch can't hear you, I'll just repeat it to him, okay? All right, so our speaker, as I said, is Fletcher Crowe. And he is, of course, we all know, a member of UCD. And Fletch has, what you might not know, is he has a BA in European History from Stetson University, and an MA and PhD in that wonderful rival school, FSU. Yay. Oh, I see some, okay, Fletch, you got some support here.
Go Knowles.
And where, most importantly, he studied Soviet foreign policy. He has taught at the Florida Atlantic University in Boca Raton, at Brenau University in Gainesville, Georgia, and most recently in the history department of Bethune-Cookman University in Daytona Beach. He's done a lot. He's conducted research in medieval England and on the French exploration of Florida in the 16th century. But most important to what we're doing today, he studied Soviet foreign policy, and his dissertation was on Soviet access to the Turkish Straits in the Ukraine. It's hard to think of anything more apropos. So maybe today he can tell us how we can still help to avoid a war between Russia and Ukraine. Thanks, Fletch. Take it away.
Thank you, Sue. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. I would love for people to ask questions. Tristan told me that there's one microphone, so if you want to ask questions, I think you need to raise your hand, and I think Tristan will bring the microphone over to you, okay? And I'm sure we've got people on Zoom who want to participate. I've got a lot of slides, so forgive me, I may go pretty fast to try to get in with the hour that we have devoted to this. I can stay any amount of time you want after the hour is up, but of course some people will want to be leaving. So Sue, if you would give people a high sign when the allotted time for this talk is over. Some people may want to leave, but I'll hang around for whatever we need. My system, for some reason, doesn't seem to be showing my picture, but just rest assured that Tristan promised me that I look like Robert Redford. So you have an idea of what you're missing here. All right, let's go to the first slide if we can. Let's see. There we are. About Texas in 1845. You thought this talk was going to be about the Ukraine, right? Well, you were wrong. It's about getting Texas into the United States. But here's the question. Right now, shut your eyes. Just shut your eyes right now for a second and ask yourself, what would happen if Mexico lined up 190,000 troops on south of the Rio Grande River and demanded that Texas be returned to Mexico and to Spain? What would happen? What would the President of the United States do? What would the Secretary General of the United Nations do? What would Texas do? What kind of a question is that? Just think about that. Just think of that analogy for a while here. Today, we've got a whole bunch of terms. Here are some of the things that are going to be mentioned. A lot of these you probably already know, of course, but you may end up learning a few here today. We're going to be talking about medieval Kiev and Ruse. We're going to be talking about the Russian annexation of Ukraine. We're going to be talking about the Crimean War of 1853. We're going to be talking about the 1930s with Stalin and the Kulaks. We're going to talk about 1938, the Anschluss of Austria, and Chernobyl in 1986. We'll talk about Russian natural gas. We'll talk about the Minsk agreements. If you guys are a little bit fuzzy on what the Minsk agreements were, an hour from now, you won't be fuzzy about them. We can talk about Yalta, which I studied in graduate school. We'll talk about Ukraine getting its independence in 2014. No, earlier. I'm sorry, I misspoke. In 1991, we'll talk about NATO. Can you guys list all the NATO countries now? It's a lot different than it was when you were an undergraduate in college, and so forth. So we got a lot to go over today, and we'll be having plenty of time for questions. But let's see what we've got here. But first of all, here's your quiz for the morning. Here are 10 points. Can you score 10 out of 10 on this? By the end of this talk, maybe you can, but here, look at these. Are there any that you find a little fuzzy right now, a little uncertain about, or do you know all 10? If you know all 10, you can just leave Reimer Hall and go get a McDonald's or something this morning. No need to stay, but here are the 10. We'll come back to this little quiz at the end and see if you can get 10 out of 10 at the end of this thing. Which ones of these are you a little bit hazy about?
Donbass.
Donbass. Somebody's hazy about Donbass. Does everybody know what javelins are?
No.
Does everybody know what kulaks are? Does everybody know what the main terms of the Minsk Agreement was? Hey, we're gonna have some fun here this morning. Okay, well, here's the number one point this morning. What is the Ukraine? Well, here's a map of Europe, and Ukraine is in brown, as you can see here. On its eastern side, it's totally surrounded by Russia, and notice it is contiguous with Poland and with Slovakia, which is half of what used to be Czechoslovakia, and it's contiguous with Hungary and Romania. And of course, it has access to the Black Sea, and therefore through the Turkish Straits into the Mediterranean. So it's a very strategically located, and at one time it was considered the breadbasket of Russia, because obviously it's in a lower, warmer climate, and grain grows very well in Ukraine. It's about the size of France, about the size of Texas, and it has over 40 million people, so it's a very major country. In general, the people in Ukraine think of themselves as European rather than Russian, as a rule of thumb. Well, here's a contemporary map of Ukraine showing Russian emplacements, Russian troops. Notice on the eastern side, we have a very large emplacement of Russian troops. And somebody said they weren't quite sure what the Donbass was, but the Donbass is where you see it says Donetsk. That comes from the word Don, which of course is a very major river in Russia, which flows down to form the eastern border of Ukraine. So in general, the Russian troops are on the right or on the east of the Don River, and of course, the disputed territories, which include Luhansk and Donetsk, are on the west side of the river. Also, you notice, of course, Crimea, which is a peninsula in the Black Sea, is annexed by Russia, was annexed in 2014, and there are Russian troops there. So if you were the president of Ukraine, you'd feel really surrounded this morning. In fact, I heard, I guess just yesterday, that now they're counting 190,000 Russian troops that are in battle-ready positions, which is very frightening. But let's go back in history. One of the things I thought would be of value this morning would be simply talking about the history of Russian-Ukraine relations. It's very important, I think. And from what I've been able to see in CNN and reading the New York Times or whatever, we don't really see this long connection between Ukraine and Russia. And I think it bears some importance here this morning. So let's just go back to about 500 BC, which is about 2,500 years ago, about the time of the ancient Greeks. At that time, the area north of the Black Sea was controlled by nomads called the Scythians. They were very mean-spirited, frightful, brutal people. But you can see here they were good with gold. But you can see some of the sites where archaeologists have dug up results of Scythians. But the next slide shows, yeah, here, about 1,000 years ago, we had what was called Kiev and Ruse. In other words, there was something of a government or a people, and the headquarters was what was known as Kiev, which today, of course, is Kiev, the capital of Ukraine. And the reason that I have this little slide in here is because in an emotional manner or in a traditional sense, Kiev is sort of the heartbeat, the mother lode of today's Russia. So sometimes, you know, Americans kind of think of the Pilgrims and Thanksgiving and Plymouth Rock and so forth as our kind of emotional foundation. Kiev kind of represents that to a lot of Russians because 1,000 years ago, that's where the action was. Now, we can move on in time, and I think everyone knows that we had the Tsarist rule in Russia for many centuries. But one of the objectives of the Tsarist government was to move toward the south to get access to warm water ports on the Black Sea. Obviously, northern ports like Murmansk or shall we say St. Petersburg were covered by ice maybe half the year and were of no value at all to sailing ships at that time. So they really wanted to have warm water access through the Crimea, through the Black Sea, through the Turkish Straits into the Mediterranean for access around the world. And that, of course, was a major aspect of the Russian foreign policy for all that time. Today, obviously, with missiles and long-range jet bombers, things are a little different, but still very important. Now, let's skip to 1853, 1856, the Crimean War. In 10th grade in high school, you probably studied the Crimean War for at least 10 minutes, but what was the Crimean War? Well, we know that the Crimea is a peninsula that hangs down on the north side of the Black Sea, and the Crimean War in 1853, we saw an alliance of France, Britain, and the Ottoman Empire against Russia, against the Tsarist Russia. Well, the Russians lost, and you can see a drawing here of what one of the battles looked like. You can see that the drawing indicates that the battles, for all intents and purposes, kind of looked like the American Civil War. And if you think about it, this was very close to the time of the American Civil War, so it was not very similar in that sense. But the Russians were able to prevail, and the Crimea and Ukraine became a really integrated full part of Tsarist Russia. And it's been that way now for hundreds of years before Ukraine got its independence.
Wait, did Russia win or lose?
Was there a question there?
Yeah. Yeah, did Russia win or lose? Fletch?
Russia was on the winning side of a coalition. And so from 1853 until the independence of Ukraine in 1991, Ukraine was just a province of Russia. So let's turn the clocks ahead a little bit to 1938. Maybe some of the people in the room here can more or less remember something like this from early childhood, perhaps. In 1938, Hitler had come to power in Germany, and he demanded that German-speaking areas like Austria be integrated into the German Empire. And if you remember, at Munich, the English met with Hitler and gave in. And they said, well, you go ahead and take over Austria. We'll just let you have it, and we're not going to contest that. And of course, that has been known as appeasement ever since. And I think what we're looking at today in the terms of the Russian-Ukraine conflict really harkens back to Anschluss. If, let's say, Biden or France or Germany or England or somebody gives in to the demands of the Russians, would that be appeasement? I think that's the question that all of us face. So a few years before that, we had the Russian Revolution in 1917. If you recall, the revolution was in the middle of World War I. And so the new Bolshevik government left World War I, and then there was a revolution. There was a civil war in Russia, and of course the Reds, the Bolsheviks, won, and that's what we've seen ever since. But following World War I, we had the Versailles Treaty, and the importance of talking about that this morning is that in Eastern Europe, you had a whole chain of small little countries created there at Versailles. You had Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and so forth. Countries that on their own can't really fend off against a great big power like Russia. But anyway, they were created at that time. But what I think is important for all of us to remember here this morning is that Ukraine was not considered an independent country at that time. Now, at the end of World War II, Ukraine was given the power of an independent state by the United Nations. So Ukraine has had a vote in the United Nations ever since. That doesn't mean that it's always operated independently, of course, but they were seen as independent at that moment, 1945. Well, fast forward.
Glad you have a question. Hang on.
Yeah, okay.
Was Nikita Khrushchev from Ukraine?
Sue, can you help say that? I couldn't hear that.
Was Nikita?
So just one.
Okay, was Nikita Khrushchev from the Ukraine?
Yes.
Thank you.
Sure was. He had been a mayor early in his lifetime. Okay, let's fast forward to the 1930s. If you recall, Stalin, of course, was the leader of Soviet Russia, and his policy, of course, was to have collectivization for everybody, all sectors of the economy. And that included having collectivization of the Kulaks in Ukraine. Kulak is defined as a farmer, an independent farmer in the Ukraine that had over acres of land. And the Russian troops moved in, and something like 2 million Kulaks were either killed directly or forced into exile in Siberia or into the east. Just terrible, terrible, horrible decimation of these people. So that figures into the calculations that we see on the front page of the newspaper nowadays, the horror that these people had to endure. 2 million Kulaks were gone. Well, as World War II progressed, the leaders, Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin, met together at several locations. One was at Yalta. Here we see a picture of Churchill with Roosevelt in the middle and Stalin on our right here. And the agreement, of course, at that time was that the Russian troops could move toward their west and take over the countries that they invaded, which of course included what we know today as East Germany and Hungary and Poland, Czechoslovakia, and so forth. But here you see at the bottom of this slide a picture of the Battle of Stalingrad. Stalingrad is just too horrible to apply words to. Over 2 million casualties in that one battle, in that one city. 2 million. It's seen as the biggest battle in the history of warfare. Now, today, Stalingrad is known as Volgograd, but it's on the Don River, and it's right at the area that's under consideration today with the Donetsk. So it's right in the center of the conflict area. But you can believe that memories are long, and memories go back and remember the horrors of Stalingrad and the deprivation and the starvation and just so many bodies in the streets that nobody could get buried. Just horror beyond words. Say again? I'm afraid I didn't hear that.
Okay. Was Stalingrad?
Sue, can you repeat the question?
Yes, was Stalingrad located in where Ukraine is now, or is it in Russia now?
Well, it's right on the Don River. It's
On the border?
It's well, it's on the west side of the river, so it's technically in Ukraine. But in a minute, we'll talk about how in 2014, the little green men invaded that area of Ukraine and declared it was under Russian control. So the actual government operating in the Donetsk is pro-Russian, even though on paper that area is Ukrainian. The people living in that area of Donetsk actually think of themselves as Russian in the sense of speaking Russian at home and, you know, having a Russian type of Orthodox religion, eating Russian food or whatever. But they are on paper, they're inside the bounds of Ukraine. So fast forward again a little bit here. We can talk about Chernobyl in 1986. I think everybody here on this call remembers Chernobyl. You see the picture here on the right, taken above the nuclear reactor building at Chernobyl that blew up. There were 4 reactors there. This, of course, is one of them that blew, but they eventually shut all of them down. And that area has been declared a zone of no habitation. One of the interesting things here in this Ukrainian-Russian situation that we're talking about this morning is that Russia has a lot of troops on the north side of the border right there in Belarus, and to invade toward Kiev, they would have to go through the Chernobyl area, which is off limits, of course, because it's so radioactive and so dangerous. So that kind of limits what the troops can do at that location. But of course, people remember Chernobyl very, very well, obviously, still today. So 1991, a lot of us will remember what they called the color revolutions in East Europe. The first one, I believe, was Poland. And then, of course, you had Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania declaring their independence. Hungary was invaded, remember, in 56, but Hungary gained its independence. And Czechoslovakia split in 2 and gained its independence. And Ukraine was one of the countries that gained its independence from Russia. Now, my friend Vladimir Putin says that the independence of Ukraine from Russia was the greatest tragedy in history. I can see why he says that. It was an area of 40 million people that declared themselves independent of Moscow. But we see here the Donetsk in orange on this slide. We see Crimea in brown, and all those areas have been under Russian control since 2014, which was what is that, 8 years ago, I guess. And of course, where it says orange right there, it says Donetsk. That's where Volgograd is today. So here's an ethno-linguistic map of Ukraine. I find this very interesting. You see the bright red area. About 80% of Ukrainians speak Russian. Now, that doesn't mean that they're necessarily Russian in culture, but until relatively recently, Russian was required in schools. And Russian is a very common language in Ukraine today. You see the yellow area on the right, that's areas where people normally speak Russian at home and at church, in business. So it's a very common language. And of course, that obviously produces a lot of sense of cultural closeness with Russia. So I think the number 80% is something worth remembering. 80% of the Ukrainians can speak and understand Russian. So one of the items in your 10-point quiz was, what is a javelin? If you remember, Donald Trump got involved with javelins up to his ears. The Congress had passed money to provide javelins to Ukraine, and Donald Trump called Zelensky on the phone and said, okay, if you dig up dirt on Hunter Biden, I'll send you the javelins. Well, he got impeached for that, as you recall. But here's a picture of a javelin. It's noteworthy. The javelin's a very smart little rocket. It can find a tank a mile away, and then when it sees the tank, it can come straight down and it attacks the hatch on the top of a tank, which is the least armored part of a tank. So it blasts its way right in and can just destroy a tank. Also, it's called man-mobile, which means, of course, it can be fired in all sorts of places. It can be hidden. The person that fires it can run away and hide in a forest or something. And so it's considered a very lethal weapon. Now, Zelensky has asked the United States and other countries for more of these javelins, but so far, at least publicly, the Americans have not responded to that request. And so it's an open question as to whether the Biden administration would want to once again provide the javelins, as was discussed before. Very, very lethal, very powerful weapon, especially with so many tanks threatening to come across the border into Ukraine. Well, another one of your questions in that 10-point quiz was NATO and the countries of NATO. When a lot of us were young in school, we learned NATO had several countries as members. But if you can see this map on the left here, in recent years, a lot of countries have joined NATO. See the ones in lighter gray, those are the newer members. Look, now we have, in addition to the ones in dark blue, which were original members that were joining NATO right after World War II. The ones in light gray include Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Bulgaria, and Slovakia, and so forth. So what does that mean? Well, it means that Putin feels surrounded. He feels like he's got a nutcracker surrounding his country of Russia, and he doesn't like it. And he doesn't want Ukraine to join NATO. The question of Ukraine joining NATO is really not on the table right now exactly, but you can see why he really is reluctant about that. Let's take a look at this chart here on the right. Russian military strength as compared with Ukrainian military strength. There's really no comparison. You can see that in terms of active military personnel, Ukraine has 200,000, but there are something like 190,000 military surrounding Ukraine right now, with, of course, another 500,000 that could be brought in. In terms of tanks, the Russians have 10 times the number of tanks that the Ukrainians do. In terms of Navy, the Ukrainian Navy is tiny compared to the Ukrainian Navy, and the Russians have a Black Sea fleet right there, just a few miles from Ukraine itself. And in terms of artillery, you can see the numbers. In fact, maybe some of you saw on television that the Russians artillery have been bombarding a kindergarten in the Donbass area lately. Just knocked it all to hell. And in terms of aircraft, the Russians have 10 times the number of military aircraft that the Ukrainians do. So there's really no comparison here. But Ukrainians have a backbone. They're pretty interested in self-defense. So let's fast forward again to 1962 and the Cuban Missile Crisis. You can see on the left in this picture an IRBM, an intermediate range ballistic missile of the Soviet Union in parade in Moscow. This was the type of missile that the U-2s found that were in Cuba, and that was the heart of the Cuban Missile Crisis, of course, under Kennedy in 1962, and the Russians agreed to remove those IRBMs from Cuba. But there was a secret agreement at that time that the United States would remove its IRBMs from Turkey, even though it was secret. The Americans removed 100 IRBMs, and it was considered a good swap, and the world did not erupt in warfare. But I think there's a lot of comparability with the situation in Ukraine today. The fact that the Russian missiles were so close to America in 1962 is similar to the problem that Putin faces in Ukraine today. So let's look at the Russian emplacements surrounding Ukraine. You can't really see details in this particular map, but all these little red notes are troop emplacements and possible locations for invasion. You can see down in the southeast here, where it says the Sea of Azov, which is just east of Crimea. There are some authorities that think that's where the attack from the Russians would most likely be, and in this case, the Russians would attack between the Donbass and Crimea to try to link those two areas together. You can see on this map the little town called Donetsk, and you see the Crimea. It's quite possible that the Russians would try to link those two areas together, although we'll see. Anyway, the Ukraine is pretty well surrounded. And just here's another map of the Russian emplacements. Well, here's a date I think we all need to remember: 2014, 8 years ago. In 2014, Russian sympathizers had a guerrilla campaign against the Ukrainian government and took over control of the Donbass in the east. And there were massive riots and all sorts of chaos in Kiev itself. They were called the Maiden Rights because the word maiden evidently in the Ukrainian means independence, or the Independence Square was Maiden Square. And this is a picture here of what it looked like at that time. But it was awful, and that's exactly what the situation still is today. After those riots, the Russians and Russian sympathizers are still in control. I don't know about the little green men, but certainly those areas are controlled by Russian sympathizers. If you remember, one of the points in that particular conflict was that the Russian troops shot down a Malaysian airliner. You remember that? Just awful, just terrible. A commercial airliner heading to the east, and of course everybody on board died. Just awful, just awful. Well, so where are we here today? To find out what the world ought to do, we can tune into Fox News. And it's interesting that Fox News has been supporting Putin in all this. At one time, Republicans were very strongly anti-Russian, and were against giving in to anything. But of late, Maria Bartiromo of Fox News has been saying this whole affair is the fault of Hillary Clinton. It's interesting. And if you tuned in to Tucker Carlson at all, you'll find that he's rooting for Putin too. If you remember, John Bolton was a foreign policy advisor in the previous administration, and he thinks that the Russians are headed to southeastern Ukraine to try to knit those Russian-held areas together. And that's his take on things. So we'll see if Fox News is right. Now, one of your 10-point questions this morning was the Minsk Agreement. And I think this is worthy of us taking a little while to remind ourselves of what it was. After the incidents of 2014, a year later, in 2015, we had the Minsk Agreement. You can see in this picture, at that time, we had Putin and Angela Merkel of Germany and Hollande of France, and Poroshenko, who was the head of Ukraine at that time. He's gone now. We have Zelensky. But those four leaders signed an agreement, which is still an important foundation of this whole question of Ukraine and Russia today. And so what did it include? Well, number one, as you can see here, number one, it was a ceasefire. And so the groups of little green men in Donetsk and in Luhansk were supposed to quit firing. And then number two, there was supposed to be a withdrawal of heavy weapons beyond a buffer zone, what they call a zone of conflict. And then the ceasefire was supposed to be monitored by a group in Europe. The truth of the matter is, though, today there is still a lot of conflict, regardless of what was signed in 2015. And in many cases, people that are trying to find some sort of peaceful solution to all this are trying to harken back to the Minsk Agreement to make it have some teeth. In recent weeks, Moscow have said that the Russians are withdrawing, but in fact, that's not been what's happening. When I first started putting this slideshow together, we found that there were something like 130,000 Russian troops surrounding Ukraine. And now, as of this morning, they're reporting there are 190,000. So that's definitely not withdrawing. So how does this affect us here in Gainesville, Florida this morning? Well, one way that it could affect us very directly is that the international price of oil could skyrocket. And today, the main source of foreign currency in Russia is the sale of oil to 4 countries: the Netherlands, Germany, Poland, and Belarus. And it's quite possible that if Russia does invade and the international community cuts off the sale of Russian oil, there will be a situation in the market where there's far more demand than there is supply of product. And you know what that means? It means that the price of oil could just really leap and really skyrocket. And that could affect us all, of course. So what would happen? Biden has said that he believes that the Russian invasion is already going on. What could we see in the next week or 2 or 3? Well, you can see at the upper left here on this slide, the Russians could interfere with Ukrainian cyber system that apparently has already taken place in terms of Ukrainian banking system. It wasn't that long ago that the Russians totally shut down the cyber infrastructure of Estonia for several days. Now it's been restored, of course, but that's something the Russians can do and have done. Number 2, it's feared that there could be a lot of assassinations. Number 3, there could be heavy economic penalties on Russia. I don't know if Sanford Berg is in the audience out there this morning, but if he's there, I'd like him to talk about that. He's got some views on what could happen. The Ukrainians could attack with drones. The drones were supplied to Ukraine from Turkey. And so the Ukrainians have these Turkish drones. And of course, they're very lethal, obviously, and could really kill a lot of Russians. In a minute, we're just going to talk about natural gas situation and so forth. So a lot of horror could occur, a lot of death, a lot of destruction, a lot of misery. And I think that's why it's important for us today to consider this. What is our role as citizens in the United States when we see this potential for death and destruction? What is our role? We don't need to talk about this in here, but let's get over to natural gas. You can see on this map on the left, lines in red that are natural gas lines from Russia into Europe. You can see at the map on the right is a map of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline that has gotten so much attention in the press of late. Notice that it is under construction right now, and it comes down the Baltic Sea, right in the center of the Baltic Sea, but it ends in Germany, and then it feeds natural gas into Germany and to northern areas of France and so forth. So Biden has gone on record to say that the Nord Stream 2 wouldn't be completed if Russians invade. But look at all the other natural gas pipelines that feed Western Europe. We can see one here coming into Poland right here. We see one coming, actually a parallel two lines coming across the center part of Ukraine into Hungary. And we see, of course, Nord Stream up here. And then we see one even crossing the Black Sea heading into Romania. So there's a lot of dependence on natural gas in Eastern Europe and Western Europe. And if those supplies were shut down, it would be a dreadful situation. How do you keep warm in Germany if you can't get Russian natural gas? The price of natural gas would skyrocket. And we know right here in Gainesville that a large share of our electricity is generated by natural gas. And if the world price of natural gas begins to leap, you know what that means to electric prices here in Gainesville. And here's another point that was on the 10-point quiz, the stinger. If you remember during the time that the Americans were fighting in Afghanistan, the word stinger was used a lot. And this is what a stinger actually looks like. The stinger is given credit for chasing the Russians out of Afghanistan, because with these man-mobile Stinger rockets, the Afghan fighters could knock the Russian helicopters out of the sky, and they were very effective. And the Russian helicopter pilots did not want to fly, and of course, Russia left. So Ukraine has been asking for more of the Stingers. They have received some from Lithuania, but of course, Zelensky wants more. You can see why. And we're getting, of course, toward the end of this formal part of the talk, and we can get into some discussion in a few minutes. But here's a picture of a Russian warship in the Black Sea. You can see these big tubes on either side of the ship. In those tubes are what are called sea-launched cruise missiles. And the Russians are very proud of these sea-launched cruise missiles. They have a range of 1,500 miles. And so a ship like this with these sea-launched cruise missiles in the Baltic, way away in the Baltic, can actually strike a target in Ukraine. And so even though the cruise missiles may originate not close to Ukraine, they're still very lethal and could cause a tremendous amount of death and destruction in Ukraine and elsewhere. So it's a very frightening situation. But here's a picture of what downtown Kiev looks like right now. In English, you see the sign that says they're going to resist. So we'll see what happens. They're going to resist, they say. The American government has given $1 billion in loan guarantees to the Ukrainian government because they realize that the economic situation in Ukraine could be really dreadful. And they may need this money to keep afloat. But $1 billion is a good amount of money, but I don't know if that's going to keep a whole government of 40 million people alive, but that's what they're working on.
Why is that sign in English?
Okay, repeat the question so I can hear it.
It's aimed at us.
Why is the sign in English?
Why is the sign in English? I don't know. They're looking for American money, I guess. No, I don't know. Good question. So who's gonna help you if Russia invades? Is it going to be the Americans speaking English? The Germans have been pretty lukewarm about this whole thing. The French have been very active, and the British have been very active. So it sounds logical to me that they would put a sign in English. They wouldn't do it in Turkish, I guess, or Lithuanian. Anyway, do we have anybody in the audience that can read Russian here? You see the Russian at the top of the screen here?
Yes.
What does it say?
Yo, Святого Valentina, there's an extra K on the end, it shouldn't be there. Happy Valentine's Day.
Happy Valentine's Day. Yeah. This is a Valentine from Russia, right? 190,000 troops around the border. So I just added this slide this morning to end this up here. From what I can read just in the last 24 hours, Biden is now saying that the Russians have decided definitely to move in militarily. And Kamala Harris in Munich yesterday said that she said, quote, "We believe that Putin has made his decision." Boris Johnson in Britain said, quote, "Russia is planning the biggest war in Europe since 1945. Now, all three of those statements are based on military intelligence, which is very hard to confirm, of course, but that's what they're saying. And that becomes the basis for foreign policy, it looks like. But I ask the question, where is the United Nations in all this? Russia is a permanent member of the Security Council and therefore has veto power in the Security Council. But the Secretary General of the United Nations has been silent, as far as I know, on all this, and has not taken an active role. In many of these conflicts like this, the United Nations sends peacekeeping troops in to patrol the border and to try to make things settle down. I have not seen that discussed as an option yet. And I don't know why. Is it because Russia is on the Security Council as a permanent member? I'm not sure. But in any case, the United Nations has been silent, essentially. And so to end this little talk, we have a great cartoon that I found. I thought this was wonderful. Stop threatening me. All right, that's all I had in terms of a formal presentation. So let's throw the meeting open to discussion and talk. So I have 11:18 right now. Anybody that needs to leave, of course, can, but we can chat. And Tristan, if you would move the microphone around to somebody who wants to make a comment or ask a question or something, I'd appreciate that so we can make sure that everybody can hear. All right. Well, thank you very much. You've been a great audience.
Well, I don't know if you heard, but you had a round of applause, Fletch, and we already have a question for you.
Well, thank you.
Hang on a second.
Fletcher Adkins, define the little green men more carefully.
Thank you.
Right. Well, they're not yellow. They're not red. They're not purple.
Thank you, Fletch.
Exactly who are they?
Cover their uniform.
Well, they're seen as guerrillas. They're not seen as actual members of the Russian military, but they're acting as pawns of the Russian military to represent the Russian military. And they of course have weapons, and they have been actively engaged in violent confrontations.
No insignia or anything like that.
But nobody's claiming them. I mean, Russia just has them out there. They're obviously Russians, right?
Well, they speak Russian. They're Russian in language, and they're Russian in position of support. But it's said that they're not members of the Russian military in official capacity.
Like ducks.
Wait, the comment was they quack like a duck.
Yeah.
If it quacks like a duck, walks like a duck, and looks like a duck, is it a duck?
Yes, hang on just a second.
Yeah. What diplomatic relationship does Ukraine have with Turkey?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a great question. Turkey has been supporting the Ukrainians. And as I said earlier, they've supplied drones to the Ukrainian government. You could say, well, why is that? Well, one point is that Turkey lies, of course, on the Black Sea, just like Ukraine does. And therefore, if the Russians took over, there could be really awful military conflict in the Black Sea. So that may be part of it. I haven't seen anything more than that. Now, remember that Turkey is a member of NATO, and became a member of NATO in 47 when the Cold War was first beginning. Turkey has the ability to close the Turkish Straits in the time of a conflict to a power that it's at war with. Now, Turkey is not at war with Russia at this point, but that's a very powerful capability in terms of international law. If Turkey, as a member of NATO, were in conflict with Russia, the Turkish Straits could be closed to ships that Turkey doesn't want to have get through there. Now, the Russian Black Sea Fleet, it has been supplying the Russian troops in Syria at a Russian military base that's on the Mediterranean, where Syria has access to the Mediterranean. So that figures in their strategy, I imagine, because obviously Syria is south of Turkey, and the Turkish Straits see Russian ships going through there to supply the Russian troops in Syria. So it seems to me that it's logical for Turkey to not want the Russians to expand their influence in that area. That's my guess. That's all I know. I don't know anything more official than that.
Thank you very much.
Yes, I've got a question. In the eastern Ukraine, there's a number of areas that are named. Are all those areas the Donbass, or is it just certain ones, or I'm confused by that.
Well, let's see if we can go back to a map. We have a pretty good map of that region. Let's see. Here's one map. Let's take a look at this map here. You can see where the capital is, Kiev, up here. Where I'm. Can you see my pointer on your screen there?
Yeah.
Okay, you see the pointer. All right, and you see the Crimea down here as a peninsula. All right, the Donbass, of course, is over here where the pointer is, right here, and north of that is Luhansk, which is another province. So this area where the pointer is the Donbass region. Now, what was your question exactly?
So is the Donbass, those three areas there, Donetsk, I can't pronounce it, but the one that starts with C and L, is that the Donbass, or is it just a general area? Is it well defined? Or?
Yeah, the Donbass is more of a region rather than an official province or state, we could say. It's an area. Let's go back to another slide earlier. Wait a minute here. Yeah, here's
Okay. Yeah.
This is Luhansk right here where the pointer is. But Donbass is this region. It's right along here. Okay. And where you see the wiggly border, that's the Don River. Now, the people living in this area that's yellow right here think of themselves culturally as Russians. I mean, they speak Russian all the time. Kids go to school in Russian type schooling. They're probably members of the Russian Orthodox Church and things like that. So they don't feel particularly Ukrainian. In fact, here's a takeaway little quip. Here's a little statistic. Before 2014, when you had the little green men, you had a parliament in Ukraine, and a plurality of the members of parliament were actually pro-Russian. Let me say that again. Before you had all this that went on here, in the Ukrainian parliament, there was a plurality of Russophiles, people that thought of themselves as Russian and wanted to be reconnected with Russia. Now, today it's different, of course, because these areas that you see right here in yellow aren't represented in parliament, so it's different. But you can see how strong the pro-Russian tendencies were in Ukraine at that time.
Okay.
But we could translate that number, that statistic, into the question that faces us as adults with voting power in the United States today. What should the position of voting citizens in Gainesville, Florida, in the United States of America, be vis-a-vis a threat to Ukrainian independence? People in UCG have a long, proud history of supporting peace and being opposed to warfare and military solutions to questions, what should be the position of members of UCG and members of the American public today?
Fletch, we have some other questions. Hang on a second.
Another question. Can you move the microphone to the questioner?
No. Short answer, Fletch, no.
Could
We
you
just have
point
to,
out on the map the Turkish Straits, which are controlled, that could be shut down?
could you point out on the map the Turkish Straits, which could be controlled or shut
By
down?
Turkey, yeah.
All righty. Okay, let's go to an early one. Let's see. I can do that. Well, okay, this map's good. Here, here's a map. You can see where the pointer is. You can see where it says Constantinople. Today, that is Istanbul. But you see the Black Sea here. You see the Mediterranean down here. And you see where it says Bosporus right here. And you see where it says Dardanelles. So the Turkish Straits is this area right here where you have access through the Turkish Straits to the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. And obviously here in 1853, this map is of the Crimean War, where the Straits were of major importance. But in 1947, immediately following World War II, this area was seen as incredibly important. And of course, this area that you see with the pointer is Turkey, and was Turkey in 1947. And so the American and allied governments made sure that Turkey joined NATO so that this area, the Turkish Straits, could be closed in the event of warfare, certainly in the event of attack by Russian or the Soviet forces in 1947. And of course, it continues today.
Fletch, we got a couple other questions, so hang on a second. Yes, did you have one? No, you,
Right. You referred to an attack on a kindergarten, and I've read of other attacks. Who's attacking whom?
All right, I heard the question about the quote unquote attack on the kindergarten. Let's go back to a map that was down here. Well, here's a good map. All right. We're told that the long-range cannons that fired the ammunition into the Donbass area were actually inside Russia. Now, it's in the gray area outside of Ukraine, and the cannon fire came over the border into the populated area where the kindergarten was. And if you saw CNN yesterday, you saw some of the damage that the artillery fire caused. Now, the Russians have been saying that the firing took place because there were Russian citizens that were threatened inside Ukraine. In other words, in the yellow area here. It's very hard to confirm that sort of thing. And I guess that's why I added this question about the United Nations at the end of this little talk. In some instances, you would see United Nations emergency forces, UNEF, come in to patrol an area of conflict like that, and then investigate any claims that somebody was threatened. That, of course, hasn't happened yet. But the Ukrainians are saying that those shells came across the border to endanger citizens, and in this case, little kids.
I've been curious, Fletch, we've heard that these sort of attacks have gone on for a while now. This is not a first, right? I mean, it's horrendous, but not a first. So do people think they tend to originate in Russia, in the Donbass area, and it's just a red flag? I mean, it's just a pretext so that Russia can invade. Is that, I'm confused on sort of the history of these attacks.
I'm afraid I couldn't hear your question, but regarding pretext, according to Biden, American military intelligence says that the Russians have been planning all sorts of pretexts that are ginned up. They may be artificial and maybe totally fallacious, but the Russians are planning those to seemingly allow invasion to occur.
Okay, well, another question, Fletch, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
All right, go ahead.
Let me just say, this is my friend Bob, who has a long history of being a professor of the Russian language and Russian culture, and has spent much time in Russia.
Oh, did you hear that, Fletch?
knows
No,
that.
not at all. Can you
Well,
get?
Bob is here.
Bob Bowie is here.
Oh, good. I'd like Bob to be able to talk. He has views on all this, and Bob knows what he's talking about. So maybe
Yeah,
let's let Bob talk for a little while.
yeah.
Could you put it back to that very last cartoon with Putin standing there?
Yeah, put it back to the last cartoon you had up on the screen, Fletch.
The cartoon?
Yes,
The very
the
last
cartoon.
thing. Okay, I have a PhD in Russian literature. I spent a large amount of time in Russia and Ukraine, Kiev, many parts of Russia. I was a Fulbright scholar in Russia for a full year. One time I had a Russian wife. I had a Kievan, Ukrainian girlfriend for 7 years from Kiev. I know a little bit about this. I don't take sides in this issue, and I appreciate everything that Fletch has said. A lot of things I even learned myself, but the one thing he has not done in this lecture is present Putin's point of view. What we get here, and this is a typical political cartoon, we have a,
Oh, that's good there.
I don't think Fletch can hear anyway, but we have a guy who looks like a rat, basically, the bad guy in the picture, doing terrible things to the innocent good guy in the picture. And that's the way political cartoons are, that's the way you do it, black versus white. The point about this whole issue that I don't think Fletch has made is the Russian point of view on the whole issue, or Putin's point of view on the whole issue, which is the Russian geopolitical unity, which is 1,000 years old now, has been encroached on all sides by enemies throughout 1,000-year history of Russia. Most effectively in the 13th century from the east, when the Tatars invaded Russia, subjected all of Russia, and kept them as vassals and slaves for 200 years. Okay, it's a long time ago. Have they forgot it yet? No, they haven't forgotten it yet. And one of the reasons why they haven't forgotten it is because it's in their genes. It's in their very genes. Look at a Russian. Look at a lot of Russians today. They've got Tatar blood. When they come and get you, they take your women. When they suppress you, they take your women. They've never forgotten that. Meanwhile, they're being encroached from the west. Napoleon invaded Russia and tried to take Russia. Hitler invaded Russia and encroached from the west. This is very recent history even. But the issue we're talking about here is basic geopolitics. Putin has been screaming for at least the last 10 years, stop encroaching upon our country from the west. Stop coming in and putting more countries in NATO. Don't do it anymore. Nobody listens to him. Nobody has listened to him. He's been screaming about this for years. Now they're coming in, they want Ukraine and Georgia in NATO also. They've got Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia in NATO. They've got Poland in NATO. They've got all these countries that used to be part of the Soviet bloc in NATO. It's a geopolitical issue. Stop pushing in on our borders. And worst of all, putting missiles, American missiles in countries like Poland and Romania, putting American missiles in there. And then having the gall to say to Putin, oh, don't worry about those missiles. Those are defensive missiles. Those are aimed at rogue states like Iran. They're not aimed at you. Okay, we put them on your borders, but they're not aimed at you. They have nothing to do with you. I'm just wanting to give this is the Russian position. Do I agree totally with Putin? I don't really like Putin. He's a ruthless politician, extremely shrewd, intelligent politician. But that's his position. You know, do I want to abolish NATO altogether? I think it should have been done at the end of the Cold War when the Soviet Union fell apart. But the Estonians, the Latvians, Lithuanians would not agree with me. They're in NATO now. The Poles would not agree with me. They remember back when I was already alive. I was born in 1940. What happened to them in recent history? Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, they were swallowed up by the Soviet Union. So I don't say that Putin's position is totally correct and right, but that's it.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Very helpful. Yeah. Right.
Well, thank you, everybody. Are there any other questions before we wind this thing up? Thanks, Bob.
Vote.
Thank you, Fletch. Thank you very much. You did
Thank you,
great.
everybody. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, of course.
Okay, thank you.
Very
Sue.
well.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thanks everybody for coming.
I thought Fletcher